The turkey was still warm when my sister looked across the table at me and said, "Mom and Dad are signing the house over to me. You're not getting anything." Everyone cheered. I mean that literally. My aunt started clapping. My uncle raised his glass. My cousin, who I hadn't seen in 2 years, let out this little whoop like she was at a football game. And I just sat there with a forkful of stuffing halfway to my mouth, watching my family celebrate the fact that I was getting cut out of the only thing my parents had ever built. I smiled. My dad's eyes met mine across the table, and I watched his face go very still. I said, "Dad, should I be the one to explain, or do you want to?" His fork hit the plate. My sister stopped smiling. And that's the moment I'd been waiting for. Not with anger, not with revenge in my heart exactly, but with the kind of quiet clarity that only comes after years of being the daughter nobody bothered to protect. Let me back up. I grew up in a house where the rules were different depending on which daughter you were. My sister, I'll call her my sister because that's all she is to me now. A Ro, not a person I recognize anymore, was 2 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to notice things, I noticed that she and I lived in parallel universes inside the same four walls. When she turned 10, my parents threw her a birthday party with a rented bouncy castle in the backyard. I remember standing at the kitchen window watching the neighborhood kids jump around in it, eating cake with pink frosting. When I turned 10, we had dinner at home. My mom made spaghetti, which was my dad's favorite, not mine. The year my sister wanted to start gymnastics, my parents signed her up without blinking. When I asked about joining the school choir, it was free. All it required was a permission slip. My mom said she'd have to think about it. She never signed the form. I don't tell you these things for sympathy. I tell you because the small things are the ones that calcify. The big betrayals you can almost narrativize your way through. You can tell yourself a story about it. But the small ones, the birthday with spaghetti instead of cake, the permission slip that never got signed, those live in your body. They become the quiet voice in the back of your head that says, "You are less than." My dad's mother, my grandmother, Gran, I called her, was the person who noticed. She lived 40 minutes away in a small house with a garden full of marigolds, and she had sharp eyes and a sharper memory. When I was 12, she took me aside after a family dinner and said, "I see what's happening, and I want you to know it's not about you. It never was." I didn't fully understand what she meant then, but I held on to it. Gran was the one who sat with me while I did my homework. She was the one who drove me to my college application appointments when my parents forgot twice to take me. She was the one who told me when I was 17 and crying in her kitchen, "You are going to be fine. Not because life is fair, because you are going to make yourself fine." There's a difference. I went to state school on a partial scholarship and covered the rest with loans and two part-time jobs. My sister went to a private university. My parents paid her tuition in full. I didn't ask them to help me. By then, I already knew the answer. After college, I built something. It wasn't glamorous. I worked in healthcare administration, started as a coordinator, got licensed, worked my way into a management role. I got an apartment. I paid off my loans in 4 years. I built an emergency fund. I started a Roth IRA at 24 because Gran had once slipped me a book about personal finance when I was in high school and I'd actually read it. My sister bounced around. She'd moved back in with my parents twice by the time she was 27. She married a guy, I'll call him a husband, who had a lot of ideas and not much follow through. They had money problems. My parents quietly helped, in the way they quietly helped her with everything, without fanfare, without conditions, without ever seeming to notice that they weren't doing the same for me. I wasn't bitter about the money. I want to be honest about that. I'd made peace with the financial imbalance years ago. The way you make peace with a chronic ache, you learn to work around it, and mostly you stop noticing it until something presses directly on the spot. What I hadn't made peace with was being invisible. My mom had this habit of calling me and spending 45 minutes talking about my sister's life, her husband's job, their apartment situation, their plans, and then saying, "Well, I should let you go," before asking a single question about mine. I used to wait for it. I'd count in my head. The record was 53 minutes before she remembered I existed. I still showed up. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday dinners when I could make it. I told myself it was for Gran, which was mostly true. But there was also a part of me, the part that was still 10 years old, watching the bouncy castle from the window, that kept hoping something would shift. It never did. But I stopped expecting it to somewhere around the time I turned 29. And that's when everything in me went quiet in a way that probably looked like peace from the outside but was really just a total absence of hope. That's not a sad thing, actually. It's clarifying. The call came in October, about 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. It was my dad. He sounded tired, which wasn't unusual. He'd been dealing with some health stuff, a blood pressure issue the doctors were monitoring, nothing acute but enough to make him sound slower on the phone. He said they'd been thinking about the future. He said he and my mom wanted to make sure things were in order. He said the house had some financial complications. I'd learn later exactly what that meant, and they were looking at options. Then he said, "We want you to co-sign something. Just a formality. We just need your name on it to help us refinance." I asked to see the paperwork first. He said he'd send it. He did not send it. I asked again 2 weeks later. He said he'd been busy. My mom called and said it wasn't a big deal. Just a signature. I was making it complicated. My sister tested me and said, "Just do it for them. Don't be difficult." That word, difficult, is one I'd been called my entire life whenever I asked a question that inconvenienced someone. I did not sign anything. Instead, I pulled the property records online. It took me about 20 minutes. The house was in my parents' names, as expected, but there was also a notice of federal tax lien attached to it, IRS, going back 3 years for an amount that made me sit very still in my desk chair for a long moment. The house wasn't just complicated. It was underwater in a way that had nothing to do with the mortgage. Whatever my parents had wanted me to co-sign, signing it would have made me legally responsible for debt I had never incurred, on a property I would never own, for a situation I'd never been told the truth about. I closed my laptop. I went for a walk. I thought about Gran, who had passed away this spring before, and what she would have said. "You are going to make yourself fine." I didn't call my parents. I didn't tell my sister what I'd found. I just waited. Thanksgiving was at my parents' house. It always was. I drove the 2 hours down on the Wednesday night before and stayed at a motel instead of the house. My mom had texted to say the guest room was available, and I'd replied that I had an early errand to run Thursday morning, which was not exactly true, but was not exactly a lie either. The table was set when I arrived. My mom had used the good dishes, the ones that only came out for company and holidays, and there were those little cardboard pilgrim figurines she'd had since before I was born, arranged in the center of the table between the salt shakers and the gravy boat. The whole house smelled like butter and rosemary. My aunt and uncle were there, 2 cousins, my sister and her husband, who shook my hand with the energy of a man who had already had 2 glasses of wine. My dad hugged me at the door. His hug was different than it used to be, shorter, more careful, like he was bracing for something. I smiled and said it was good to see him. I meant it, in the way you can mean something and also know it doesn't change anything. We sat down. My mom brought out the food. My sister talked about a trip she and her husband were planning, somewhere in Mexico, and her husband talked about a business idea he'd been developing, and my aunt made appreciative noises. I ate my green beans and listened and thought about the tax lien notice and kept my face very still. It was after the second round of mashed potatoes that my sister set down her fork and said, "Actually, there's something we wanted to share." My mom looked at my dad. My dad looked at his plate. My sister said, "Mom and Dad have decided to sign the house over to us." She gestured at herself and her husband. "We're going to be taking it over, taking care of them as they get older. It just makes sense." She looked at me. "You're doing well on your loan. You don't need it." My aunt started clapping. My uncle raised his glass. My cousin said finally, like she'd been waiting for this announcement. And I sat with a forkful of stuffing halfway to my mouth and looked at my dad, who was looking at his plate like it owed him something. I set my fork down very gently. I felt the whole table watching me, waiting for me to cry or argue or storm off. I did none of those things. I said, Dad. I waited until he looked up. Should I be the one to explain what's actually happening here, or do you want to? The table went quiet. My sister said, What are you talking about? I said, The tax lien. My dad's jaw moved, no sound came out. I said it slowly, clearly, for the whole table. There is a federal tax lien on this house. IRS, going back 3 years. The house cannot be transferred cleanly because of it. Signing it over to anyone right now would transfer the liability along with the property. That's what they needed me to co-sign, not a refinance. A loan to cover the lien with my name as a guarantor. My aunt had stopped clapping. My sister's husband put his wine glass down. I found this in the public property records, I said, which anyone can access. It took me 20 minutes. My sister turned to my dad. Is that true? My dad said, It's more complicated than that. My mom said, We were going to fix it. We just needed more time. I said, More time to do what? The lien has been there for 3 years. Nobody answered. My sister's husband excused himself from the table. He went outside. He didn't come back for a very long time. I found out later that was the beginning of a conversation between them that would last on and off for the next 2 months. But that's not my story to tell. I stayed at the table. I finished my dinner. I was polite. I helped clear the plates. I said goodbye to my aunt and uncle who left early and to my cousins who were very quiet. Before I left, I stood in the kitchen with my mom and I said very quietly, I'm not angry. I want you to know that. But I'm also not going to pretend this didn't happen and I'm not going to sign anything. She said, You're making this bigger than it is. I said, Okay. I drove back to my motel. I ordered a grilled cheese from the diner across the street because the turkey hadn't sat right in my stomach. I sat on the edge of the bed and called the one friend who knew the whole story from beginning to end, and I said, It happened. She said, Are you okay? I thought about it for a real moment. Not a performed moment, but an actual one. Yeah, I said, I think I actually am. The weeks after Thanksgiving was strange. My parents called a few times. My mom's calls had a texture I'd never heard from her before. Something almost uncertain, like she was feeling her way across unfamiliar ground. My dad called once and started to say something about how he'd always tried to do right by both of us, and I listened, and then I said, I know you believe that, and I left it there because there wasn't anywhere useful to take it. My sister and I didn't speak for a while. When she finally texted me in January, it was a long message that covered a lot of ground. Some of it honest, some of it deflective, some of it things she'd clearly been sitting with for a long time. She said she'd known, somewhere, that things hadn't been equal, that she hadn't known what to do with that knowledge, that she was sorry. I believed her. I also knew that belief and repair are two different things, and we weren't there yet. Maybe someday. I wrote back something short and honest and left the door open without making any promises. The house situation resolved itself slowly. My parents worked with a tax attorney. The lien didn't disappear, but it became manageable in a way that didn't require my signature or anyone else's. My sister and her husband did not end up taking the house. I don't know what the long-term plan is, and I've made peace with not knowing. What I do know is this. Gran left me something when she passed. Not money, though there was a small amount which I put toward a down payment fund. What she left me was a letter, handwritten on the pale blue stationery she'd kept in the drawer of her writing desk for as long as I could remember. In it, she said she had watched me my entire life and that she had never once worried about me the way she'd worried about my sister, and that this was not because she loved me less, but because she trusted me completely. She said, You always knew what you were worth, even when you pretended you didn't. I've read it so many times the paper has gone soft at the folds. There's a version of this story where I stand up at that Thanksgiving table and deliver some devastating speech. There's a version where I walk out and never look back. There's a version where I am the villain, where I am the hero, where I am the wounded child demanding to be seen. I am none of those things. I'm just a woman who did her homework, who didn't sign a paper she hadn't read, and who sat at a holiday table and told the truth when the moment came for it. My sister didn't get the house. I didn't get the house. Nobody got the house. But I left that Thanksgiving dinner knowing exactly what I was worth. That's the only inheritance that was ever going to matter.